Hello and welcome to episode 30, Synergies between public and private entities in the space industry. Today, to take a deep dive into this topic, we have with us Deepika Jeyakodi. Hi, Deepika, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Omkar. Very happy to join you here on this incredible podcast.
Thank you very much, Deepika. We have known each other in the industry, and I always wanted to have you on the podcast. But yeah, I thought it would be better to have a person like you once I have an appreciable amount of audience who will take a good perspective from you, not only of the space law, but of the space business as well in the industry. So, without any delay, I would like to first ask you about your journey. So, how did you end up being in the space industry? Briefly, just tell us about your journey in general.
Okay, so my background was in law or is in law. I studied at the Tamil Nadu Ambedkar Law University in India, after which I was practicing in the Madras High Court. And after my first master's, where I specialized in international law, I was quite interested in following that up with at least a focus on one aspect of public international law. And while I was contemplating between human rights law and a few other subjects, I came across aviation and space law. I thought this is quite new, and later on I learned it wasn't. So I decided to do that as a learning, get a master's in that as a learning exercise, and that was my first step into the space industry. After which I worked for about 8 years in the Netherlands, aerospace and defense company, which gave me the opportunity to get a grasp of how things work within the space industry. And yes, I think that's added quite a lot to my knowledge and experience.
Interesting. I believe I'm first time. It's the first time that I'm having a space law expert, I would say, at least from an academic side as well, even though, you work on several ends these days, but primarily a person with a space law background, it's the first time we are having on the podcast. So, without any delays, I would like to actually take a deep dive into the topic now. Because primarily we have seen these days public and private entities are collaborating. The commercialization has opened up not only in the United States, but even in the Asian countries too. So, from your perspective, how do public and private entities collaborate in the space industry? In general, what are the benefits of such synergies? And can you even provide some successful examples of the same?
Sure. If you look at how public-private partnerships work in the space industry, I mean, this is the vehicle which is used by a lot of in a lot of collaborations between public and private entities. This can come in different shapes and sizes. Huh? So
Yes.
let's think about an axis where on one end of the spectrum, you have a public body. So this can be any governmental agency or an organization that is procuring either a product, service, or a capability from a private entity. And on the other end of the axis, you have a private entity that owns, operates, and does everything by itself. Now, PPPs can be in any form, shape, and color in between these two ends. And you find different combinations in which in a public and private entity. And this is a combination of designing, building, operating, maintaining, financing, or even commercializing at some point. And you see these different flavors utilized in different manners depending on the sort of result they want out of the collaboration, the budgets that are available, or sometimes even the nature of the application itself. So this is how collaborations are set up, and in that sense, it's not different from the sort of PPPs you have for traditional sector. So if you, and by traditional sectors, I mean if you look at public infrastructure, where PPPs are most oftenly used. They focus on optimizing resources, how costs and risks are allocated, how can we gain efficiencies, and so on. In space specifically, there are a few other layers that come in, which are, I wouldn't say industry specific, but they are more useful for the industry. And this could be promoting innovation, taking this product, service, or capability to the market at a, let's say, at a faster speed, putting focus on certain expertises, and maybe even aligning policy goals. So there's a lot of learning from each other. There are hard and soft elements. There's a lot of learning from each other. There's looking at the same vision from different perspectives. And I think those are the benefits of having these two stakeholders, or maybe even more stakeholders, who have different interests coming in together with a shared vision or a shared objective.
Interesting. And I mean, you mentioned about the several aspect of the synergies, but I believe when a government agency collaborates with the private sector, along with a lot of perks, of course, there might be some level of frictions as well, because the operational capacities of both the sectors are different. So, what challenges do public and private sectors face when working together in the space domain, and how are they overcome?
In terms of challenges, I think in retrospect, if we look at a lot of cases, I mean, you'd earlier asked about successful examples. And I think I struggle a bit with identifying cases that are entirely successful. There are models that work for specific countries, there are models that work for specific players, whether they are, let's say, private educational institutions or private commercial institutions, and so on. And if you look at some of the more popular partnerships, whether it's the NASA's Commercial Crew Program, the European Space Agency's Artist programs, the European Commission's Horizon programs, or even the one with the military touch, the European Defense Fund programs, you can see that they all have some common elements, but they are also structured differently depending on the kind of parties. So I think if we
Yes.
go back to what sort of challenges do these entities face when they collaborate, I think the first question is asking why we need a public-private partnership in the first place.
Yes.
What is the reason we need to come together to have this shared objective and shared vision? And then the second question would probably be, what is the right model? And then based on the examples that I mentioned, I think there are smart people who are defining, okay, this is the model that we think fit best kind of research, or this kind of development, or this kind of commercialization in future. So
Yes.
this is more the why and how do we do things part. There is another part which is more often sidelined when we talk about public-private partnerships, or even more generally when we talk about collaborations, because there's no one-size-fits-all. Depending on who the parties are and how they are brought together, there
Yes.
is a lot to be done in how we can balance risks, how we can balance control, how do we balance the interests of the different people coming in. And I think
Mm.
this is one of the biggest challenges. So if you, from a lawyer's perspective, I think doing the negotiations are probably the toughest part. I think if you say, well, this is the result that we need, we will find a way to do it. But having to balance these interests and finding a way in how we can achieve that, that's where the biggest challenge lays. And then, of course,
Yes.
within the point of interests, we have different things such as, okay, are they a user? Are they a developer? Do they want to own things? And as a consortium, do we have complementary interests, or do we also have conflicting interests that maybe when we sign, we don't really pay much attention to, but later on we realize, okay, there's a lot of friction that's coming out of it. So balancing this commercial versus science versus governmental, all of these interests, that's one of the biggest challenges. And then, of course, you have
Yes.
content-related challenges, which could be about IP and data sharing. How do we deal with the governance? Who does what? I think those are additional layers that you can build on top of that.
Yes.
Is there a way to overcome this? I think that entirely depends on, again, the parties who are sitting around the table, how they want to achieve the shared vision, whether they want to compromise, whether they want to make a stand, or whether they get creative with how they are going to design their collaboration in such a way that they can achieve the goals, making it a win-win for all.
Interesting. I think you briefly also covered how the public-private synergies drive innovation and technological advancement. So, just taking a step further, uh, I mean, this question is primarily more from a strategic perspective of how public-private partnerships should be, given preference. So, given the fact that the space industry is highly under a government-controlled ecosystem, I mean, even though we have the commercialization going on, we see still in Europe, especially, the contracts are still, coming out of the European space Agency, and that's how most of the companies actually are able to develop the solutions. So, do you believe private space companies need to work on setting their independent narrative strategy to have a fair amount of independent voice in this industry?
I think the private industry's voice is heard. It is out there. Um, should it be more or not? I think that depends on the sort of collaboration and who the collaboration is with. Um,
Okay.
just thinking out loud, if it is a collaboration with, let's say, a military customer, the sort of checks and balances that you have, even though it's a partnership, it might be unbalanced because of the requirements that the military customer has to put forward because of national security, and voice would depend on the sort of checks and balances that are being built in. And I
Yes.
think no matter which side of the line you stand, it's important to make note of the voice of the other, because there is definitely a reason why these parties are entering into a public-private partnership, right? So, of course, the
Yes.
companies are driven by commercial interests. The military or any other public body might have their own interests. There is a reason why they come together. And I think this is when I reiterate the point that I said earlier, that there needs to be a proper balance between the sort of interests that are being brought out. If
Yes.
there is an imbalance, I think then there's not much difference between having a procurement versus a true partnership.
Yes.
So I would say I think having a narrative, having an independent narrative, is necessary, but maybe it's not something that you always need to have.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with this point actually, as you mentioned. It depends on, what kind of collaboration is. And as you mentioned about the military space applications, so what role does government policies play in fostering and supporting public-private collaboration, especially in the development of military space applications?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I'm going to try answering this with perhaps one example,
Yes.
the European Defence Fund. So this fund was, I think, the discussions on this started somewhere around 2015, 2016, in order to create a sort of innovative and competitive defense industrial base. European the European Union, sorry, um, uh, focuses on its strategic autonomy. In this sense, this fund when it was established, it had the same issues as it is facing right now. I mean, the focus on having the European Union's strategic autonomy is very much valid as it is now,
Yes.
as it was, let's say, 5 years ago. And the public-private collaboration in this instance is quite interesting because it's looking to coordinate the national activities through investments, but also looking at how we could have product, service, or capabilities that are interoperable. This might seem like a small thing, but it adds so much value to the
Yes.
autonomy that they are seeking. And here, the fact that it started as a policy, that these were discussions that are now operational, where they're going through different processes. I think it's about 8 billion that is spread across from 2021 to 2027. This is going to do quite a lot, no matter how small or how big the projects, how effective the consortia are going to be. They are going to learn so much from each other. They are going to draw on each other's strengths, and every party is going to have skin in the game.
Yes.
The impact of this is probably something we will realize maybe 5 to 10 years from now. Nevertheless, I think what started as a policy discussion has played a role in developing a framework under which universities, industries, to collaborate and develop space applications. So
Yes.
so I think there's a lot that policy can bring along.
Interesting. Yeah, we actually had some guests who discussed about the GovSatcom program.
Mhm.
But yeah, this is the first time we are hearing about European Defense Fund. So yeah, thanks to you for providing insights on it, because GovSatcom program is fairly, I mean, publicized, and I mean most of the people know in the industry about it. But European Defense Fund, it's good that you provided insights on that as well. So I mean, just a question related to this only, because we have seen that the US ecosystem in the space industry, they have achieved a fair amount of success in creating a sustainable ecosystem for private space companies through the SBR and STR program. But we still see several other nations are still struggling to, possibly streamline the way US has streamlined their military space ecosystem, both for the public and private sector participating in the development of a military space application. So what are
Mhm.
your thoughts on this issue in general, like how the other countries can streamline the way US has streamlined their military space ecosystem?
Mhm. Well, I don't have first-hand experience with SBIR or STTR programs, but what I do learn from, let's say, podcasts and journals and so on, is that while they have strengthened and fostered a good network, let's say a good network and a good ecosystem, which is conducive for such public-private partnerships, they also have their own challenges to face. So just with the SBIR programs, I think it was earlier this year, maybe sometime around January, when their tenure had to be extended. There were a lot of voices that raised the question that there were serial beneficiaries of these grants.
Yes.
So there were entities whose major business model was getting these grants, while they still had poor track records in terms of how they commercialize these technologies or capabilities, or spinning them out into new companies. So, but
Yes.
what they did in order to address this was to set new performance benchmarks, and and another element that they were struggling with was also how can they secure certain countries from, let's say, abusing the US system gain access to, let's say, US national technologies and so on. So they had to build in these security restrictions. So what I like about this is that although the ecosystem and the way it's implemented, although it's not perfect, they had a way to overcome this challenge. And in terms of other countries having to struggle, I think the context is quite important. For instance, I think around 2015, 2016, if I'm not wrong, China released a white paper on having public-private partnerships in space. Russia has historically also engaged in public-private partnerships. And it's quite interesting to see how, despite them having successful programs or maybe partial success with some of these elements, they tend to have their ups and downs. With China, I understand it's a lot about, let's say, how the legal framework is set around having questions on how state-owned or state-affiliated enterprises have a sort of an unfair advantage over private entities. And I think depending on the context of these nations and the sort of results or the shared vision that they are aiming for, they can design their own collaboration frameworks. And what you could see as common components is seeing, okay, how can we make this simple for different parties to come in? And again, I sound like a broken record. Again, how do we balance these interests? I think if these two things are settled, then preparing a governance structure to set up these things, promoting the ecosystem, orchestrating how the ecosystem functions, those things would come easy. So I think governments need to start thinking like private entities, and private entities, of course, need to start thinking about common interests as well. Maybe it's a bit idealistic, but perhaps this is what we need in order to streamline collaborations.
Yes, as I believe, like as you mentioned, it really needs to be, working both ways. Because at the end, of course, it impacts the economy, the investment, and the growth of the nation as well, and in general, the space industry too. So, just moving ahead, I'm taking up this question more from, I would say, the kind of security perspective. How do public-private entities handle intellectual property and data sharing in collaborative space ventures?
This one is also quite interesting. I think, again, depending on the result that is expected and who the user of those results are, the way intellectual property is approached, how it's distributed between the entities, those change. So again, on an axis between having full control to keeping it fully open, there are a lot of flavors that you can draw in. Just to give you an example, the Horizon program within Europe had an interesting scheme where the IP can be distributed amongst the parties in such a way that it benefits the most parties. But there were conditions attached to it. So there were conditions like research and development institutions or scientific institutions that are a part of a consortium. They would have the right to publish the results. And of course, within the consortium, you have to find a way in which you don't compromise the commercial interests of a company where if you publish things, then perhaps there's not enough value. So in my experience, you would engage in a lot of discussions on, okay, to what level of granularity do we put information outside, or are there elements that can be preserved by the consortium, that can be used for the competitive advantage, and so on. And the EU in itself, they also built in a mechanism where they had to, of course, justify the public spending on these projects. And they said, if a consortium member who has rights on certain IP, if they do not use the IP within a certain time duration, they can lose rights
Yes.
to it. So it can go back to the grant giving organization. And I think this is it's quite interesting how there is enough
Yes.
to define how IP can be distributed, to allow for these entities with different interests to come together. Having said
Yes.
that, on paper, this is all great, but in practice, I think it's quite common that everybody thinks about their own interest.
Yes.
And next to that, we tend to look at IP as a black and white element. Either you want it all, or you want to give everything away.
All right.
But there are quite a lot of things in between these extremes as well, where you can consider how you distribute IP in terms of, okay, what sort of applications can you have, what sort of applications can I have, what is the geography within which we can use, or is there a time limit set to the sort of competitive advantage that I can gain before I publish everything out. These are elements that we can play around with, and I wish more public-private collaborations made use of such creative IP distribution mechanisms, because this can
Yes.
help resolve the protracted negotiations that you go through, and you don't leave a discussion table feeling that somebody got a better deal than you did. In the
Yes.
end, I mean, as we discussed earlier, there is a shared vision. We are all in this game together for a reason. So we just need to play around with these mechanisms to see how we can benefit from that.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, the next question that I'm asking is not, of course, related to intellectual property, but I believe it's a little bit futuristic from this perspective, because as you have mentioned repeatedly in the podcast, that things depend on the kind of ecosystem that is there, the kind of collaborations that are happening through the public-private partnerships. So, but still, from your perspective, and as a person who has taken a deep dive into the space industry for several years now, so looking into the future, what potential breakthroughs and discoveries can we expect from continued synergies between public and private entities in the space industry?
I'm going to disappoint you, Omkar, and then talk a little about IP here as well. But
Yes, yes. Sure, sure. No worries. Yes.
before I do that, I think
Yeah.
as someone working in the space industry, I think it would
Yeah.
be interesting to see how these public-private collaborations are leveraged for our pressing challenges right now. So whether it
Yes.
is looking at climate monitoring, developing insights that we can use to either monitor, evaluate, or maybe even take action on, and then maybe also in terms of space situational awareness and space traffic management, even in orbit servicing. I mean,
Yes.
these are three things where we often encounter the question, okay, is this, if it was done purely by private entities, is this economically viable? And if this is
Yes.
done purely by government bodies, how can we make sure that private entities and all the other users take accountability and responsibility on how it is utilized? So I think
Yes.
PPPs will be a great vehicle in terms of developing these technologies, or finding solutions together, not just the technological front, but just finding solutions together. And on the
Yes.
other side, if I zoom out a bit and then look outside of just one of the special things about our industry is that it has quite a lot of impact on other industries.
Yes.
It can be used for the benefit of other industries a lot. And again, here, I think public-private partnerships should think about how in the future we can accelerate even existing IP. So it doesn't always have to be that we define things from the scratch. We could also look at what we already have and see how we
Yes,
can come together to take it forward in developing a common good. And I think this is something that that these collaborations can explore a bit more. Again, touching upon the climate emergency part, how can we use what we already know so far? How can we leverage this to take action? I think that is something. It would be great to see
yes,
collaborations on that front.
definitely. Yeah, I really hope the industries, even especially the uh, young entrepreneurs who are stepping into the space industry, take a lot of insights from this conversation, and especially the last point, as you mentioned. And I mean, we are at the end of the podcast now, and generally, of course, the podcast is meant for primary the industry people, both from space defense and security as well. But it is also meant for the students who are either right now pursuing the studies, or who have just completed the studies and trying to get into the space industry, no matter from which walk of life they come from. So the
Mhm.
last question I always keep dedicated for the students, because as an expert I always feel that uh, even uh, even a minute insight for the career path can possibly change someone's life. So from that perspective, I would like to ask you, what suggestions and recommendation would you give to the students who would like to pursue their career in the space industry?
This is always a tough one. So I'm going to answer this as I would have answered myself some years ago, and it's
Yes.
still something that I still something that I use to check in with myself now
Yes.
and then. I think in the space industry specifically, we tend to look up a lot. We look at the wonders of space and all the activities that we are doing here. But sometimes I think we also need to lower our heads a bit and then look around.
Yes.
And by that, what I mean is it's great that so many students and young professionals, they already know exactly what they want to study. They know this is the career path that I want to take. This is the subject that I want to specialize it, and so on. But I
Yes.
would suggest that they also make room for learning from people who are not within their own subjects of study, and learning from industries that are outside of the space industry as well.
Yes.
I think this is what will give you an edge in any, let's say, an edge, or make you special in any room for that instance. Secondly, it's also super interesting when you can connect the dots, when you can apply what you've learned within the space industry from the perspective of someone or something else outside. I think that's where you can add a lot of value. So I hope more of us do that, and I hope we can all collectively learn from each other through that exercise.
Great, great. I mean, the connecting the dots is the very important thing, because I believe space at the end is not a independent subject like STEM. It's a
Mm-hmm.
multidisciplinary subject. So we really need people from all the backgrounds, who will actually try to come into the industry and set things apart, by bringing their own, I would say, interest, and connecting the dots to use the space applications in a more sustainable manner. So yeah, thank you very much, Deepika, firstly, for giving your precious time, and I hope the audience takes away a lot of key insights from this conversation, because this is the first time we are having a session which is dedicated to public private partnership, and I really hope even the industry cherishes this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omkar, and I really hope your audience finds this useful. Thanks for the
Yes.
opportunity.
Yes.